garbage, whatever they can find. And once they're actually living on the site, the city will come and build a house for them. And it's also a way of allocating money in a good way to housing. In other words, you tax employers to be able to install the utilities and build the toilets. And then you can build a piece of a house and they build another piece, and they use their own labor as part of the equity. That's their contribution. It's called sweat equity or self-help housing. So there was much of that going on in Africa at that time. And then look at the vital street life that happens around all of this. Next. Then the Anglo-American lent Johannesburg, I think it was £3 million, and they built 100,000 units of housing in 3 years. Now, America was building 20,000 units of public housing a year at that time. England was building, the whole of England, 100,000 units, I think, a year at that time. Johannesburg built 100,000 units like this, carefully worked out by the Bureau of Research into Housing in South Africa. It looks soul-destroying. It looks much like the new cities when you look at its plans. And when we talked to the people who were designing it in the municipality, they said, we like single-family houses on the ground. Why would we want to offer Africans something less than we want for ourselves? And I thought, well, that's one outlook. And the other outlook is, why should Africans want what we want? And that one was used to justify some very bad housing conditions that were provided. They don't like the same things we like, so we won't give them any windows. Both attitudes seemed incredibly arrogant. On the other hand, what other attitude is there? So I left South Africa very puzzled about this. Also, there was a training program. Africans were not allowed to be in the construction industries. When the English ran South Africa, they wouldn't let the Afrikaners in. They couldn't get jobs on the railways. They were just not allowed to get jobs that competed with lower income English people. So they did exactly the same thing to Africans when they came to power. They said, we will own the construction trades. Well, here Africans were being trained in bricklaying and things like that. They were also given two kinds of bricks, and encouraged to make their own patterns. So some of the detail within these are very interesting. And the building itself is very well worked out. And as far as developing area standards, the sizes are rather large compared with what happens in Latin America or India. Next. Now we're coming to Philadelphia. And here comes another theme. You see, I went to Philadelphia from there because of what the Smithsons said, and to go on to get to be a better architect by knowing more about urbanism. It's funny to me because nowadays when I write about this stuff, if I mention the word urbanism, no architect will read it. I have to keep that word out if I want anyone to read what I'm saying. It's very sad that that's the outlook on urbanism now. But the theme I'm wanting to talk about now is how you can use mapping. Mapping not just for research, but mapping for design. And so let's start talking about Philadelphia by looking at its maps. We can start here if you like. There's the downtown. The railroad city of the mid-19th century meant that a lot of people could be deposited here, and there was nothing to take them out into these areas here except more railroads this way. So you got a very high-rise center, very dense, and then this didn't get filled up till later, although you'd find sub-centers further out. So here you will see it, a dense internal area where the railroad goes. Then later when the streetcar came, that got filled out over here. But these areas got filled out early because the rail went out like that. This is called the main line, the one that goes out this way. And so you've heard about mainline Miss. Well, she lives out here somewhere. And so that's the structure, the classic structure of the railway town. And here you can begin to see in the downtown, red now stands for commercial, which will mean shops and also offices, and yellow for residential. And here's it shows you a pattern of age. This is where the town was first developed, along the banks of the Delaware. And then it slowly worked its way back there, despite the fact that William Penn laid out a grid for this area. It grew this way, not around a grid over there. And then you can see that this was a huge industrial city in the mid-19th century, with a very big industrial area along the river here. And very rich, because workers could afford row houses here. They could afford to own row houses. We've never grown back into that city. We rattle like peas in a pod in that city. Next. Here again, look at my determinants of form. There is a subsistence economy. Here's an advanced capitalist trade economy, held up by its road systems. University of Pennsylvania, where I went, was there. There's the downtown. William Penn made High Street, which later got called Main Street, Market Street rather, and Broad Street. And City Hall eventually got built there, but the original settlement was all in here, like that. Here is South Street, which is very important in our lives. This is where all the immigrants came to Philadelphia, landing here of all different races over time, and using that street as part of their upward mobility. Bob's parents owned a fruit and produce store right there. Next. Bob ran that store for a while. He was afraid he would never, ever get back to architecture. Now, look at this mapping. And this is ground floor uses only. Red for commercial, yellow for residential, South Street. So South Street is both low-grade commercial and also residential. And these are public buildings. They're really usually shown in blue. Community buildings, things like that. Industry in purple here. This was a big port area, and this was docks all along here. And this is 1958. Before the expressway came, big expressway here, another one here, and the whole thing changed. But look at these fantastic mixtures. I had a professor of urban economics who said that if you showed all the flaws of land use in a city like this, it would begin to look like a bruise. And I had a professor of transportation, as they called it, who said land use, which means activities on the land, and movement are inextricably intertwinkled. If you get a busy main street, the crossing of two busy main streets is where a marketplace happens. Meeting of for trade and for buying, and also could be a meeting of minds. And that's a very basic law of what they call city physics. City physics is sort of laws which are pretty immutable, which will reassert themselves. So one of them is whenever you get two heavy volume roads meeting, that's where people want to be. That means those are the most expensive properties. And given the nature of the geometry of a circle, there's less space at that meeting point, which is the center of a circle, than there is at the perimeter. That's why you get high rents there. That's why you get skyscrapers there. That's why you get the skyline of New York. That's rent theory. It can be highly computerized, but it's a very simple concept. And you can read from this mapping all that kind of information. Next. But at the same time, the planners were at work in 1958 making plans for this area. You see they had an expressway here. They showed another one on South Street here. They neatened it up. Here is housing and here is commercial, and they don't mix. South Street has been obliterated. It's now an expressway. And so this neatening process is the famous human removal, Negro removal, urban renewal with a very ugly face. And it's what brought the Herb Ganzers into urban planning. It's what brought the Jane Jacobs into urban planning, arguing with this line of thought. But here you see the plans for urban renewal. And of course, they blamed the architects, because these were mainly architect planners who did this kind of work. But here were the plans. And some of Philadelphia was more subtle than most. They mixed historical and modern. This is an IMP building going up there. Now here's Lou Kahn. Lou Kahn learned from my professor Robert Mitchell and from many of the others too. So here is his beautiful metaphor for looking at streets and saying they're like rivers and analyzing different kinds of movement. And so Peter Smithson was very interested in this. And here's Lou trying to map these different kinds of movement on streets. And these were what brought me to Philadelphia, although this turned out to be one of the troubles architects often have. They don't really understand the scale they're working at. And if you'd actually built this thing, it would have been vastly out of scale, with huge planes and insufficient understanding about these meeting places which cause density. The architects treat urban space like a room. We'll put furniture in it. We'll put a slab here. We'll put a slab there. They don't realize they should be seeing where the movement systems go across that space to do their job and how you hang activity patterns on the movement systems and grow a city using the reality of the site, using what is to develop it. But Lou Kahn was beginning to do that here. Why? Because he met with the people who were doing these kinds of analyses in Citizens for City Planning groups in the 1940s when we had liberal Democrats running Philadelphia. And I had a hunch, and I went to Bob Mitchell and I said, Bob, is Lou Kahn's plan actually your idea? And he was a former architect, and he got defensive. He said, I don't know, maybe I got Lou's idea. But anyway, I told Peter Reed, who was a doctoral student then, my hunch. And he went to the minutes of the meetings of the Citizens Committee for City Planning. And in one of the meetings, he found them say to Lou, you draw better than we do. Why don't you draw it up? So Lou really did learn a lot from those early meetings about urbanism, and I think it made him significantly different from other architects who imitated him. He was more able to draw it from within rather than impose it from the top. Next. Here's the University of Pennsylvania. It was garden-like, but it was right in the middle of things. It was in West Philadelphia and crossed by streets at its perimeter. And here you see we're making a case for the development of its old center as a new student center, a new student student precinct. And so I'm just wanting you to see there the notion that it was pretty urban, but it also had green open space in the middle, a nice combination of both. Eventually we did a project right here of refurbishing. Next. Now, I met then, the first semester, David Crane was my student advisor and Roberts, and when he heard us talking, he said, no, don't, we learned that Lou Kahn didn't teach in the planning school. How could that be? Well, of course, Americans had a very different view of planning. So we were going to change into Master of Architecture. And Dave said to us, for your aims, for going back to Africa and working for development and African housing and things like that, you need what this planning school can teach you. So stay with us, and I'll make sure you get the best out of Lou Kahn too. And Dave had himself grown up in Nigeria, so we had a great deal in common with him. So we stayed. In the first semester, we took a lot of economics and urban sociology and statistics and things like that. At the end of that semester, I couldn't believe I hadn't known that information all my life. How could I have lived without it? I was getting answers to my questions like, how do you do socioplastics? And the first key was the course that Herb Gans taught. So he starts as a traditional urban sociologist, and he's looking at the inner city and the central areas of the city. This is South Street, where every immigrant group had passed, where Bob's dad had a store, and etc. But it was very poor at this point. And if you looked at night, you saw people's forearms, this part of their arm, on the windowsill, because there were no beds for them. They sat in a chair, put their arm on the windowsill, and went to sleep. And that's all the housing they had. There was not enough public housing. So we studied the detail of this, and you can see the kind of detail that shows up here. This is Broad Street, where the detail is bigger because it's part of two main streets crossing. And we studied people like Park and Burgess, who were social ecologists, they called, from Chicago at the turn of the century, and all the immigrants came in, and they began analyzing the activity patterns of areas like this. And they again saw this circle of concentric uses. They said it can't be that the immigrants are causing crime. It must be the city that's causing it. It must be something to do with the location. When you're in the center of the city, you are more liable for crime. Well, it was misunderstanding, really, but it began to get them thinking about this geometry. Next. Partway through that semester that he was teaching, Herb horrified his professors by leaving the silk stocking districts and the inner city districts and going and starting analyzing suburbia. And they said, you are being a traitor to your field. You look what you're looking at, that dreadful stuff. And of course, these were the views of suburbia. That was total conformity. This woman is saying, I am Mrs., I forget her name is Edgar G. Brand or something. Can you tell me where I live? She's asking the postman, can you tell me where I live? She can't recognize her house. It's just like all the others. And there you see it. Think of the picture I showed you of Johannesburg with that same plan. Think of the new cities, the same plan, but here you get Greenbelt. I think that's the basic difference. The people in the new towns, there's more control at the perimeter. The density overall, the regional density may be the same, but there'll be higher density within the flesh of the town and bigger open spaces. These huge expressways make this available to you and your workplace available by car 15 miles away. And so this was the imagery and the mythology about Levittown. He went to live there as a participant observer and wrote his book, The Levittowners. Next. Now, at the same time, Dave Crane was teaching us a new city, taking the Punjab, the new city Chandigarh of Le Corbusier, using their program, but using another set of ideas. One of them came from the Scottish geographer Patrick Geddes. Now, Patrick Geddes had gone to to Hindu towns, and he had analyzed every single building. And these were terrible condition, these towns. So the British rulers, the colonial rulers, would cannonade a way through here. And they'd put a big street through, and they would use to control the population. He documented every single building, and he carefully removed only the ones that were falling to get that kind of a pattern, a more open pattern. You see there's a vague diagonal that goes through. A diagonal is a nice shortcut for pedestrians. He then cleaned out the pond as well, so it could fulfill the function it had once fulfilled. And there he had his recommendation that he called conservative surgery. So conservative surgery became a very important idea. Now, here we were designing Chandigarh as a linear city, because we come using the linear city as an idea, and with Hilberseimer in our minds. Then Crane said, but think of the mass city where the two main streets meet. It must be denser. We'll make half a mass city, and here we'll put all the buildings of government. Here's industry. So, and then Dave had a philosophy about streets. We use the street as a city builder, so you build these streets, and then around it, people can begin to build the city. Next. Here are the streets, and here is that kind of street running as a diagonal through here. He also had the notion of self-help. It's monsoon climate, so you don't build roads, you build drains to drain away the water. And that creates sites. And in the sites, people come, and you don't produce their walls. They can produce them themselves. You use a little bit of hard currency to buy a little bit of concrete, no steel, but a little bit of concrete, maybe pre-stressed or post-tension concrete, and you produce the members that will allow them to make roofs. So this thing is a higgledy-piggledy of private sector, the 1,000 designers, as Crane used to call them, and you've helped them a little with the drainage system and with something to help them roof their buildings. Meanwhile, you build the public structure in here. So that was one of his philosophies that we were following in thinking through development in a developing area. Next. And here you see, again, Geddes, he has marked the houses which are of different kinds. Carefully, it gives them space like that, a rather larger space than before, but the same character, with a couple of trees. And here you see these drainage areas like this, and the walls, the roofs across and the walls between, and roots through like this. And it can serve a large extended family, or it can serve small families. And it's a grid like an American grid, which can be used in many different ways. And it produces this city of 1,000 designers in his mind. Next. Now, there was another set of things going on at the same time. After World War II, computers, which had been enormously important in the war effort, for example, working out bullet trajectories, and computers were pioneered at Penn. The ENIAC was pioneered there. And people began to think about the use of the computer for peacetime purposes. And there was a lot of money available for transportation studies from the gasoline tax. Pardon the American terms, but these were the terms. You would have said petrol tax, and you would have said, I forget the transport, not transportation. But so the first thing I wanted to say is I turned to Paul Klee because I think he used mathematics to create fantasy. And I love that combination. You can use rigorous methods and still be an artist. These are sine curves. He uses them to advertise a party at the Bauhaus. And all of these, he also produces signs of madness and other kinds of neurosis in people, and their faces are defined by these curves. So there's many things you can do with mathematics, with city physics, without losing your artistry. So here's more development of that concentric theory notion. A Prussian nobleman in the 19th century goes across his different farms and estates, and he notices that he grows strawberries near to market because they rot quickly, and potatoes at the outskirts. He gets a lot of money here, much less money here. That develops into rent theory. There's a New York skyline. I drew these in the 60s before the towers that were bombed. Before those, so it was that kind of skyline at that point. And here you see these concentric circles. But you put a university in the middle of all that, which university is one of the powerful things you could put. It could also be Central Park. And these pressures of these forces will distort, but they won't go away. And then that becomes a route of movement. And the next one will be here. Next. And here you can see something similar. This is Chicago, so it's half a circle. And this is, in fact, an inverted pattern. It's car ownership. Few cars are owned near the center, many cars as you get further out. And this is before the suburbanization of post-World War II. So these are still rail lines. Now the cars would have filled in here as well. Here's the principle of least effort, illustrating relationships between the size of a town and the distance from another town, puts a point on a graph, so that the bigger the town gets and the further away, the more distant the point may be. But it all forms one pattern, one line like that. So these are regularities in urban behavior that you can understand about and work with. This is the journey to work. Different people going to work in the morning. It'd be school children and workers and others. And then many of them come home at lunchtime, so you get a pattern here of people using the city at lunch, but fewer. And then at this end, everyone goes home in the evening. More people go home than went, because it's these people as well going home. So these are patterns of regularity, which are interesting, but also they're sort of beautiful. So why shouldn't you have fun enjoying them too? I saw a movie a while back now on public broadcasting, which showed a pattern like that, but they had animated it. And I forget what the data was, but you saw the whole thing rolling by the animation. And they said, you would not have spotted that the data was circular by any other means. You spotted it immediately. You animated it. If you'd used a computer, the data is so complex it would have taken about 6 months to learn that. So look what we can do with our eyes. And so these patterns depend on the smartness of our eyes. And I think that there's all sorts of ways of transposing the notion of function to these, which are settlement patterns. They're very computerized when they're used by, they're very mathematical when used by computers, but they're the same idea. And you can develop many ways of laying activities on the ground, and eventually we take that same thinking inside buildings. Next. Say we do land use and transportation planning inside buildings. So here you can see the same idea, the rail coming out here, and the multiple nuclei city, the mass city with multiple nuclei. This is Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is a farm district. Here's a market town, and here's half a day's journey away, other little markets, and then a day's journey away, a bigger town. And here we grow that pattern like that and show how it could be. You can see this actually in parts of Germany, southern Germany, and where the Pennsylvania Dutch live here. There's not so much topography as to stop it happening, and it's very much farming communities with central markets. So the patterns are still there, although there'll be a lot of suburbanization now. Next. And that central place theory that developed that notion, it was made more sophisticated by making the shapes not squares or grids, but the shape that would completely cover that area. It doesn't leave out bits of it. That's Kristalla and Lersch's theory. Here's a student sketch design taking that notion and developing from the town of Lancaster using that same concentric idea. Next. But this was tripping along nicely, and then suddenly there's the civil rights movement. And so black power, but look what black power really meant. It meant we are dying in this environment. And the social scientists, many of the younger ones, turned social activist and social critic. Now, if there are any planners in this audience, I owe them an apology for the poster, which said, put 3 people in a bus, an architect, an urban designer, and a planner, or 3 groups. The architect will take a picture of a house or a bridge or a high-rise building. The urban designer will take the place where a bridge and a house meet, or some other kind of meeting of elements. And the planners will be too busy talking to look out of the window. Well, these nice physical planners who do the right thing got quite hurt about that. But I was actually talking about my social activist friends, people like Paul Davidoff, who talked to Blue Streak, wasn't interested in architecture, was full of criticism for us, was one of the most challenging things ever hit me, talking about participation of the poor and democracy and the issues of democracy and value systems, and working to try to end this, saying these are the people who we must be advocates for, because in the political system they should be represented, but they aren't. And planners should take directives from the politicians. They should hear what the people want. And who represents the people but politicians? But where the politicians don't represent this guy, we must. So he became an advocate planner for poor people, and we followed him. Next. So this was, riots in the streets. South Street was in danger of rioting because of that expressway they were going to put there. Where would all those people with their elbows on the windowsill, where would they sleep if they didn't have their street? So the social planning movement had a great many very fascinating philosophies. And I've been skipping around here and not following my notes, but I do want to tell you about that because I think it's... so they became social activists, and their critique of urban renewal was is and ought. You're too full of oughts, you architects. You're always telling us what ought to be. And what's more, you forget about the present, and you always look to the year 2020. And they call that the perfect vision year. So what are you going to do about the muck of here and now? You just don't want to get your feet muddy in it because it doesn't lead to nice Cartesian solutions. What's wrong with you? And Al Lowenstein, who was the head of the Dump Johnson movement, he said the same thing to the student protesters. He said, what did you do after you marched on Washington? In other words, when you go back to your own communities, do you just go on living as if nothing should change? Because that's much harder than spending a day marching on Washington. By the way, marching on Washington was a good thing. I didn't dare do it because I didn't want to be deported to South Africa. But Bob did. And so they told us we were part of the problem. They said, you're always navel-gazing. You say, what did Le Corbusier do? Why don't you go and learn something about urban sociology? Why don't you look at the new towns, the automobile towns of the Southwest, which people seem to like? They like them better than the spaces you produce. Stop being so arrogant and get to be a little more humble. Find out why they like them, at least. So these were what they were telling us. And I was rocked by it. And at the same time, I was very challenged. And they were my friends. But I also said, you know so little about architecture, you know so little about planning, and it doesn't work quite the way you say it does. Yes, the steps that you go through were the right steps. You establish goals, you look at means, you investigate alternative means, you discuss with the community the values involved in the alternative means, you get them to choose one. And I said, all of that is true, but it doesn't happen only once. It happens over and over in different ways. And which choices must the community make? Between the difference between a yellow pencil and a red pencil on a map? Maybe, depending what the pencil is depicting. But so there's many issues there, but nevertheless, it's the kind of planning method that I've always followed. Now, going back to urban design, next. Next slide. Urban design was using architecture's hand-me-downs. While Lou Kahn was developing some interesting ideas out of planning, the architects were still following Ville Radiers. And urban design has tended to do that. They are the worst among the architects because they've really lost interest in many aspects of architecture, and they're applying old formulae. But they also are trained to be administrators, and they get to make the running because the most rare skills are administration skills. So those urban designers with administration skills, that's what they did for careers. And they often coordinated the wrong things. Meanwhile, Dave Crane was trying very hard to take the lessons of the planners and apply them. And he began talking about the four faces of movement. So one of the things he said is, a street is not just a place that gives access, but remember it gives access longitudinally between towns and laterally to the houses along it. But a street also is a room. All of this is happening on the streets in India. It's a room for many activities. Cows sleep on the streets in India. Next. And here, a street is a city builder. The access it gives builds the city. But also a street is a purveyor of major symbols to a community. The symbols that we've talked about, the signs on buildings, the connotation and denotation on buildings, but also the symbols of density. The fact that you can understand that that's a place of high accessibility because there's more density here than there is in other places. There's another place of high accessibility with more density. Less density here because it's not as accessible. And so on. So there's about 4 or 5 ways as you can see the functions of streets. Next. And one of the things he said is, we have a capital program. Every city has one of the public buildings it's going to build. Let's have a capital design. Everything that the city produces is more than half the city. It's all the streets, in this case, all the drainage as well as all the streets. It's all the public buildings. And quite soon we began to see, here's the diagonal I was talking about. We began to see that this pattern was very like something new that had been visible around architecture school in the early 60s at Penn, which was the Noli map of Rome. There was an exhibition of this map in Rome in the early 60s, and it began percolating. So here is the public sector. All the white here is the public sector. But notice the poche of plans, the black of plans, he's included in the public sector. This was a map produced in 1748 at the request of the Pope to show the pilgrims where all the churches were. But let the churches stand for public buildings in general. Look at this network of public sector. Other very beautiful and interesting things. This is civic. This is just public. So there's many definitions here. And here is the public sector providing the roof and the subdivision and the drains. And here's the private sector providing some of the spaces in there. So public-private as an interplay is one of the things that you see here. And then this is the notion of linkage, that the activities in this building relate to the activities of that building, and that these networks of linkage really build the town. And our professor of urban economics, Chester Rapkin, used to give a lecture. He spent the whole hour describing the structure of the New York garment workers district, the garment district, including showing how the theaters and the hotels are all tied in with where the buyers go to buy from out of town. And the button manufacturers are also. And the whole thing forms a network to support the garment industry. And in fact, you see people dragging racks of clothing in the streets of New York, and you still do somewhat, although that thing has changed too now. Next. And sitting beside all of this was Bob Venturi, known by the dean as the architect's architect, not into urbanism. Known by me as the only architect in that place who sympathized at all when I was talking about social planning. Everyone else said, oh, those people are so churlish. Look what they think about architecture. How can you consort with them? Lou Kahn said sociologists believe in 2.5 people. How can you believe in them? And there was Bob with his socialist mother and his Quaker religion and running his father's fruit and produce store as well as his architect's office. They were about 3 blocks from each other, trying to do both. And he understood. So he and I became friends, and I taught the first semester of the theories class. He taught the second semester. Quite soon, I was running his seminars and his tutorials for his class as well as for mine, and we were collaborating in all sorts of ways. And we had a really nice time together. This building I maintain is as urbanistic as any small suburban house I know. Remember the one in South Africa as well. And for many, many reasons. I could go through it in many different ways, but I think Bob could do that too. On the inside too. Next. And here he is housing, assisted housing for elderly people, poor old ladies, some of them Quaker school teachers and other African-American matriarchs. Here he is doing a duality. You can't do that. And by the way, the head of the Planning Commission told him in no uncertain terms he couldn't do that, he couldn't do that, he couldn't do that, and he couldn't do that. We had a huge fight. But this housing is made so old people can sit here and look out of nice big windows, the kind you have in Georgian architecture here, big low windows. And it's on a street, a busy street, but they can get nice oblique views across the street there. And there's much else to say about it. Next. Here's one of the old ladies. She was very happy to have her picture taken. We wanted her way of living to be happily contained, not feel false in the building. Next. And here you see her flowers in her window. And here's the building making common cause with other buildings along the street. Next. And I went away to California. You've gathered that by this time Robert Scott Brown has been killed. In fact, I went back to Penn to finish without him and stayed and taught for 5 years. And people kind of protected me. as I refound my feet and remade my life, and my students saved my life in some ways. The nurturing I was able to do there helped me to survive. And I put everything I had into teaching, and I taught myself how to be a teacher and a planner in many respects. Then I got invited to go to Berkeley, and it was during the foul speech movement, a semester after the free speech movement. And I can't tell you too much about that. We just don't have time. But during that time, as I went to Berkeley, I stopped in 6 different cities on the way out to the West. And one of them was Las Vegas. Well, I discovered all of this, and I started. I'd been photographing in Philadelphia. I photographed before I came here. I photographed signs on 40th Street in Philadelphia and on South Street, etc. Now I had a heyday over here. But some of these, like these, were taken later in our studio. Next. Unfortunately, I haven't shown you a casino. I should have put in a picture of a casino so you know whereof I talk. This was at the time when Las Vegas was mainly a small town, a small railway town with a big strip going out into the desert. So you had high-rise casinos and desert and not much else. That's why we chose it for study. I invited my old friend Bob Venturi to come and lecture to my students, and we gave them a sketch design, and I took him to Las Vegas. I'd also been photographing a lot in Los Angeles as well. And the result of that trip was we decided to get married. We'd been working together since 1960, and this was 1967 we got married. And then I said I had been going to teach a studio on Las Vegas with the Los Angeles students, but I'm coming back to Philadelphia. How about I teach it at Yale? So that's why it was taught at Yale, not at UCLA. And these were some of the analyses. I structured these studios, these 3 big studios that we did, and I structured them on the basis of urban planning studios, which were group work, teamwork, which mixed research design in a rather organized way, which had weighty volumes written for individual students and small groups of the studies they needed to do, which had methods for everyone sharing, so everyone became a teacher who taught the other students. And out of that came these studies. But these particular ones were devised by Bob within that framework. A study of historical buildings. You see, Bob is a wham at taking historical parallels, not imitating history, but learning some principles and seeing how they play out in Las Vegas. Now, there were many other studies going on the view from the road and how perception happens. You know, Donald Appleyard, who was with me at the AA here, he worked with Kevin Lynch on some of that, and we knew his work and were influenced to some extent. But very few of them were doing what Dave Crane talked about, which was the meaningful city. You're not just defining a round green orb. You're saying this round green thing is a thing called an apple. We are perceiving it as an apple. So we are perceiving messages from the sign, not just looking at its texture and its height and its form. But its form is beautifully devised to show its message. And that's what we say, this is a contraption as much as a camera is a contraption. It's a piece of equipment to inform you about things. Learning about that, we began to realize these were billboards too, that followed the same principles. But we only could understand that once we'd studied this. And then other things, directional space, not just space, but space that has direction, like streets and others, and analyzing how you perceive them at different speeds. This was Bob in full form, analyzing Las Vegas within the basis of this research design studio. Next. It's very much applied research, not pure research. So here's this anatomy of a casino sign. And then we had already evolved, and I will tell you that I evolved the notion of the duck. I don't have time to tell you how that evolved now. But so we had this kind of analysis, but also that all buildings were either in some way a duck or a decorated shed. Now here's a decoration even removed from the shed. So the little shed just melds into the background. And on the way to Las Vegas, you see these little towns, which like that Zulu village I showed you, it's made of the same grey material of the desert. You really don't see the town. You see the signs as you go by. Tip, 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 with a rhythm that Dave Crane would have liked, because he thought a lot of the message system had to do with rhythm as you went along a road. Next. And now we begin to do what Cedric Price did. We made matrices. And we are doing the anatomy of a casino by its elements. That's why I apologize for not showing you the casino first. We also show its plan and its section here. And look at this, because that becomes very important. Next. Here is a plan of the land use of Las Vegas. Remember, it's one floor only, but here are the commercial strips. Here's the big strip. Here's the city line. Cross the city line, and the whole structure changes. Why does it change like that? Because of the law. You have to have a ratio of 5:1 parking to building from here on. And here's the desert all around, like that. Now, these colors, here's the community facilities. These colors we've taken and we've put them into the casino plans. So every casino is hugely different. But once you begin to do this, you see that behind the variety, there's a great uniformity. Walk into every casino, the first thing you see is the gambling. Then here is the conference area. Here's the housing, made yellow, which is the standard color in land use planning for housing, like this. And here's the patio, made green for open space. So they're all like that, despite their differences. Well, this has been very productive for us. We do this with all the designs that we work on now. We have a street through the building, and we put the intense activity near where the main streets cross, which might very well be a corridor and the vertical circulation in the lifts, and that's where we put the coffee shop. It's a meeting of minds, and it's a meeting for coffee. It's a place of rest. And we say if it's a lab building, where will the next Nobel Prize be gestated? At the lab bench or in the coffee shop where you're talking around a whiteboard. Next. Now we began doing distributions of different kinds of activities. So here are food stores. And that is very much like the same pattern you would have for New Haven, say, where we did these studies, except a lot of corners are filled with food stores, corner stores. Here are churches. Strangely, there's many churches as in New Haven, but it's a much, much newer city. This is gangsters with bad consciences. But the pattern is a typical distribution. Now, here are automobile car rentals all along the strip. Land use and activity inextricably intertwined. Some at the airport. Here are wedding chapels, a whole lot of them along the strip. Next. You can go to Las Vegas and get married immediately. That's why there's so many wedding chapels there. Now, here is every building on the strip shown by its footprint. And these are the more ordinary commercial strips. Here's the strip. Look at the grain of that compared with this. And here you see it in the aerial photograph. And with our, we learned to pore over all these maps and photographs and to try to understand the order within them. That was great fun to do that. I would recommend it. But look how we began to see that there was a pattern in here that had a feeling of that. Another kind of Pilgrim's Way. But nevertheless, subject to the same kind of analysis that Noli did here. You can see it there. Next. And so here we begin to analyze. Here's the footprint. This was a trailer camp. Here's all the parking and all the tarmac. This is desert. Here is the strip with all those buildings, and we're just taking the public part of their plan, as if this was the pochette of the churches. Now you're beginning to structure things by function, but in different terms, public and private, not necessarily by use as such. And here you see the footprint. I think this is the parking over here, and here's the public, and in between is some of the pochette. So we're building up a Noli plan of the strip. Next. We've since then done a no-leak plan for every campus we work on. We take the pathways all the way through to the corridors in the buildings, and we show the public auditoria and places like that as part of the public system, whether they're outside or inside. Here we've, by the way, you can't show signs on architectural plans. They're too thin to read. You can't show them on land use plans. We're looking for a way to suggest the vitality of the strip. So here we show where the signs are, and we show that this is a casino, so we show that it's a place where you read it in pink. And here is a gas station, and you'll see where you read that in green. This, in a funny way, suggests the vitality of the strip more than anything else. Here we put every single sign that we saw in the set of the strip, including the traffic lights, stop and go, all in words. So we were looking for various ways of conveying the sense of the strip without just using orthogonal projection or land use colors. Next. And by the way, these other methods were not reproduced by the people who followed us. Rem, when he did the strip, didn't use these other techniques, particularly the distribution ones, which have been very important to us. Now, while we were doing that study, we were also doing a plan for South Street. We were working as volunteers for a certain African-American matriarch called Alice Lipscomb, and she was telling us what she wanted. She would permit us to work for her as volunteers because we were Venturi Incorporated, the fruit and produce merchants. We had a stake in the strip the way she did. And now I began to, you see, the social planners always said, you use this cult of the expert. You say, I'm the expert, therefore listen to me. And I will defend my right to tell people things as an expert in other contexts. But in this context, it was just plain wrong to do that. Because what did I know about their lives? They had to tell me about their lives. So I would use that cult of the expert to say to the city planners, I am an expert, and I tell you these buildings are beautiful. I will tell you they're historically significant, whatever you think, and I'm an expert. So I used it to try to save people's houses for them. And we joined with a group of other people, lawyers and transportation people, to try to save this street. Next. Here you can see some of the beautiful, they really are beautiful, look at them. Development stopped, it just stood still, so that's a 1920s storefront, that's probably 1930s. Here are the people who were trying to sell. Next. His name, I think, was Joe Temin. And you can see up there his father on the wall before him. I think that's his father sitting there. Can't see it. Here was his elderly assistant. Here was a new person. The succession invasion thing was happening here. African Americans were moving in as storekeepers. Look at this beautiful storefront. So we really loved this area. Next. And you see it's being converted, some of it to housing. That means that and storefront churches is a real sign that an area is doing badly. Next. Very afraid of riots, very afraid of burglaries. Look at this beautiful store, just falling to pieces. And I saw this and I just said, ah. I began photographing it. Bob, think of the Lieb House. Look at that. Two colors there in this. But I think the Lieb House came before we saw this. Anyway, the point is I was just moaning with pleasure over this. And Janet Reiner, she was then, a social planner, had no time for architects. But they said, we know we need you because these people are going to be physically out on the streets. So we need physical planners to produce a counter plan to the plan of the agency. So they used us for that purpose. And then when she saw me moaning with joy over this, she said, if you can love this, we trust you not to neaten up South Street at the expense of its residents. That's why we were starting Las Vegas. And that was one of the best things anyone ever said to us. Oh yes, and the citizens in Las Vegas once said to me, don't leave your drawings up in our, they had a little storefront office on South Street. Don't leave your drawings up there. Those drawings are masterpieces. Well, it's nice to have your drawings called masterpieces, even if they're not right. Next. So we produced a plan which said in the rich people's area of Philadelphia, they wouldn't dream of putting an expressway. They only put it here and here. So why don't you treat this area, South Street, the way you treated that? Have two streets doing the work of getting people forward and back there, and leave them in the same way as you wouldn't dream of moving those. And so here is our plan here. And here is that plan for the detail of it that you've seen before. Immediately, Alice Lipscomb said to me, "You may not show this plan." And we said, "Why?" She said, "Because as soon as you do that, all the other people who's now are getting an expressway here and here are going to be against our plan. So please don't show anything to do with transportation, even although your expertise tells you you should." So it's, again, very interesting what you need to do and what you mustn't do when in planning of this sort. Here we showed where South Street would indeed be large scale. And here are community areas where it should be very small scale. Next. And here was, the planners used to say, "Why are you always designing buildings? Those buildings aren't going to happen for 10 years. Why are you showing at all the buildings?" So here we just show the programs that would be applied to the buildings. Now, this is an attempt to show ground floor uses which are commercial and second floor uses which are residential. Ground floor uses, commercial and community. Second floor uses which are residential. To get the real complexity of these areas and not trash people by just not understanding their complexity. This was the only block we recommended acquiring to put a one-stop shopping for all social services there. We'd also put an archway over the street with a big sign, and we'd paint one wall. And we said, that's all you would need to do, that there's some new care here. And we even said you could just put trailers in here. And the community said, no, you can't. If you do that, a trailer can pick up and go away again, and they can build an expressway. So we want more than just a painted wall. We really do want one building fixed up and refurbished. And then the next thing was, we said, this is a kinetic plan. It has movement built into it. The right angle, orthogonal lines are public input, public investment in these blocks. This is a forecast of what the private sector will do as a result of what we did here. Build commercial on the ground floor and residential above. So we were building in a public-private dichotomy in here as well. I once showed this kind of planning to someone in Germany. We said, we would control this less. We would control it by zoning, but not much else. He said, oh no, in Germany we will control this, and then we will control that, and then we will control the next one, and so on. But the notion that you can have action painting in the city, and indeed you must have, I found very intriguing and really a lovely way to think. Next. Then we went on to the studio of Levittown, and we did a big study. It wasn't just Levittown. It was all sorts of housing, inner city housing and social housing and suburban housing as well. Next. I want to go rather quickly now. We looked at the patterns of housing in America. Palladio is very important in England. Palladio was imported from Italy via England to America, and Palladio ends up right there, right here, by successive stages. This is Mount Vernon. Mount Vernon has colored this too, and many other buildings in America. Look at the colonial shutters here. Look at the picket fence here. Look at their translation here. These shutters would never cover these windows. I love this little building. Next. This is ethnic South Philadelphia with a great deal of Catholic imagery, but peripatetic American flag, and somewhere you'll see an eagle. The eagle is everywhere. Here's Palladio again. This is public housing. They too have put picket fencing. That Anglo-Saxon kind of imagery just goes everywhere through America. No picket fencing here, but almost. Next. And then we began, the student who did this read 44 books on sociology. Part of my teaching effort was to get people to actually want to read. And they had to read to do their projects, therefore they read. She's trying to show you how different income groups, lifestyles vary by these categories, education attitudes, leisure, and so on. Look how the very poorest, we couldn't find colored pictures. The color slowly begins to seep in because you can get pictures from advertising in magazines. No one's advertising to these people. So lots of detail of this sort. Next. And then here, lifestyles expressed in the house, working class lifestyles, middle class lifestyles, with a lot of detail in here. Next. Now we did what we call content analysis. I learned this from friends of mine who were in other programs like American Studies. You analyze the contents of different literatures to learn how people think about things like how values change about child raising, for example. So I thought, why not about housing? So here we're looking at ads about housing to see what people think who are trying to sell you turf green. Look at the winding path, the winding paths, the rainbow, the setting sun, the green hills, the roof lines, the roof lines. So these are all the hot buttons for the society that get translated into housing. So we're saying we architects have such a value system about housing, we need to understand other ones. Doesn't mean this is right, but it's another mesh applied, other than our mesh, to the same ideas. I sometimes say to people, if you're thinking about doing a certain kind of building, think about how it would be seen in the toy train town that goes with your toy train. So the little village that goes with your Lionel train, how would it show the school? So that's the archetype for school. Now, you don't have to design the archetype, but you have to bear it in mind in some way. So think about that. Well, here you get that archetype village. Next. I'm getting to the end. It's a long lecture. I'm trying to tell you about 3 different experiences in 3 different places heading toward active socioplastics and how you can do it. So these were newspapers advertising, horrifying to architects. These houses are exactly the same, they just look different. What's the housing background when they're trying to sell you detergent or a sitcom? We had someone sitting 24 hours in front of a television photographing all of these. Another literature, next slide, was Daisy Duck, daringly different. So Daisy Duck is getting away from suburbia, and she's getting modern furniture in her house. It's a spoof on modern architecture. Next. We eventually put this material into many different forms. This was an exhibition that we held at the Smithsonian in 1976. And this was themes and ideals of the American suburb. No time to go into all this. The idea was these are headlines, and you read the whole thing. And then there's subheads. And then if you want to, you can read all the detail of what we felt about American housing. And there were many, many boards like this. There was a whole section on the city. And Philip Johnson was seen to sit there and read the whole damn thing in that city room. And my feeling is his POMO, I don't want to call him postmodernism, it's POMO, specious, commercialized. It's a disgrace to what we were trying to do. What we're trying to do is postmodernism, but we can't even call it that because of what postmodernism became. So, but he read that whole section on the city, and out of that grew his view of postmodernism. Next. And then we made these collages, you could say. This was the city house. This was an Italian ethnic interior. And these were learned from Ian Hamilton, showing you the outside and the inside and telling you the origin. The same thing for a Levittown type house. And then for an ex-urban rich person's house. Now, having shown you all of that, I just want to finish off a little bit. I want to say that Bob and I had a lot in common through all of what that was going on and what I came with from Africa and from London. We found we had a great deal in common, and we reverberated. Complexity and contradiction certainly owes to the fact that people were talking about organized complexity in the planning school. But he learned that through going to my students' crits and through talking with me. It comes out there in those forms. And then going on from there, I had arrived in the United States with a set of themes and a series of questions. At Penn, I began to find answers that encouraged me to stick with active socioplastics, not to give up. Coursework in the social sciences encouraged me to continue with this theme despite its difficulties. You see, if we can learn how to teach structures to architects, not the way you teach to engineers, and architectural history to architects, sociology is not impossible. It can be taught in a way that's not going to make people into little sociologists, but help them be a certain kind of architect. My planning training helped to make some brutalist ideas usable. I began to build on them in my research and my teaching. And what, as I say, our themes were much more dour than those of Pomo, and they came out of theological thinking about postmodernism, the notion that there can be no innocence after the Holocaust, the notion that artists need to be self-deprecating a little in view of tragedies of that kind, and not pontificate too much. That was the kind of thing that we learned, to be very tuned into function as well. So having said that, Gans eventually produced his own utopia. And that's funny because he was very against utopistic thinking on the parts of architects, 2020 vision. But he's recently produced a book, and it's called Imagining the American City in 2033. It's a very moderate, mild utopia. It's a feasible utopia, I would say. So that's worth looking into. Stephen Song is here tonight. He's a young architect from Korea but lives in America and recently graduated. He has written an article called Renovating the Decorated Shed. And that's indicative of a lot of what's happening now. People are looking at our ideas, and they've forgotten that Pomo argument. They're saying, here are some interesting ideas. How do they apply today? We would encourage that mightily. Now look what's happened today. Suddenly we have huge economic disaster. We have a president in America saying, yes, we can. And I'm back to saying what I said in the 60s. When conditions are most dire, it takes greatest architectural imagination. It's a big challenge to us now to get back to some of those basic questions and think anew, but we've got many new technologies, we've got many new situations. It's going to be up to you to think how to do it. We're just trying to leave some good steps open toward it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can I just say one other thing? Tomorrow I want to show you 3 projects quickly which show how we have used these ideas. And I want to discuss your ideas with you, but first I want you to ask us as many questions as you can. I think that would be a very good way to transition between what we've done to what you've done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Denise. Everyone, I would normally at this moment pass the microphone around the audience for questions this evening to follow up the lecture. Given the rarity of the visit, we've in fact organized an entirely separate session for that tomorrow morning. As I said at the beginning, you all are absolutely welcome and encouraged to join us at 11 o'clock. You'll have an evening to think up some of those questions and ideas and for the presentation to continue. Thank you, Denise and Bob, very much for the evening.
Thank you.
In a form that I know Denise is especially pleased with, a small book that fits in a pocket. We're going to throw open the doors next door. Please come and enjoy those. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Did you like it? It seemed that they liked it. Yes. I know. Yes, I didn't. I even couldn't talk about it now. Ça, c'est à vous.
Ouais, merci.
De quoi? Oui. Il faut poser ça. Vous voulez poser ça?